Welcome to The Explainer. So glad you're here today because we are diving into a topic that is just fascinating, deeply misunderstood, and honestly incredibly relevant to global politics right this second. We're unpacking the evolution of Austrian neutrality. Now, on the surface, that might sound like a simple concept, right? A country just deciding to sit out of wars. But as you'll see, it's actually a complete masterclass in geopolitical maneuvering. We're going to explore exactly how a country sitting right in the middle of Europe, surrounded by massive alliances, somehow manages to chart its very own independent course. Okay, let's get into it.
I want to kick things off by throwing a question right back at you. What does it actually mean to be truly neutral? Really think about it. When you hear a country is neutral, what pops into your head? Is it total pacifism? Maybe hiding behind heavily armed borders? Or just refusing to even talk to anyone involved in a conflict? It's a super common assumption, but actually, scratch that. It's entirely wrong. Neutrality is absolutely not about burying your head in the sand. In reality, it requires a highly active, incredibly carefully calibrated foreign policy.
If we look at the strict international legal reality, specifically the Hague Conventions of 1899 and 1907, neutrality actually has very tight parameters. It basically boils down to three things: impartiality in conflicts, the inviolability of your territory, meaning, no one can just march their army through your land, and a strict abstention from giving any direct or indirect military support to warring parties. No weapons, no troop transports. But notice what is not in there. It doesn't ban economic relations, it doesn't ban diplomacy, and it literally never mandates global isolation.
So, here's our roadmap for the explainer today. 1. What is neutrality? 2. The road to 1955. 3. The rules of neutrality. 4. EU and NATO shifts. And finally, 5. The modern neutrality test.
All right, Section 1. What is neutrality? Once you realize that being legally neutral still absolutely allows for robust international engagement, the whole picture starts to make a lot more sense. Austria is actually far from isolated. They are heavily engaged in global peacekeeping. Right now, Austria has hundreds of soldiers participating in the UN-mandated KFOR mission in Kosovo, working literally right alongside NATO forces. They're also involved in EU4 in Bosnia and Herzegovina and UNIFIL down in Lebanon. So the big takeaway here is that military non-alignment does not equate to just sitting around doing nothing. Austria is actively participating in international security and humanitarian efforts. The catch is just that it has to be under the umbrella of a United Nations mandate rather than a military alliance. Which brings us to the obvious question: why did Austria choose this specific path in the first place?
Which brings us to Section 2, the road to 1955.
To really get Austria's neutrality, you have to look at its wildly turbulent 20th century. In 1918, a democratic republic is formed right out of the ashes of a fallen empire. Fast forward to 1933, they suffer a total loss of democracy, leading to an authoritarian state. By 1938, Austria is annexed by Nazi Germany. And then, in 1945, after the war, the country is split into 4 occupation zones controlled by the Allies: the US, UK, France, and the Soviet Union. For a full 10 years, Austria was an occupied nation, desperately trying to get its sovereignty back. And that sovereignty, finally, thankfully, came in 1955 with the signing of the Austrian State Treaty. But that treaty came with a massive catch.
And here's the catch. The geopolitical reality of 1955 was a rapidly chilling Cold War between the US and the Soviet Union. Originally, Stalin's government actually thought about creating a pro-Soviet buffer state in eastern Austria, while the Western allies were terrified Austria might just fall entirely behind the Iron Curtain. Finally, under Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviets offered a deal. They said they would sign the state treaty and pull their troops off Austrian soil, but strictly on one condition: Austria had to commit to permanent neutrality. So, you see, it wasn't just some lofty philosophical ideal they came up with. It was a pragmatic, hardcore survival tactic. Neutrality was literally the price tag for getting foreign armies out of their country. They paid it, and the occupying forces left.
Let's move on to Section 3, the rules of neutrality.
On October 26, 1955, the Austrian parliament voluntarily passed a constitutional act declaring its permanent neutrality. I'm going to read this exact quote to you because it's crucial. In all future times, Austria will not join any military alliances and will not permit the establishment of any foreign military bases on her territory. That right there is the core constraint. It's super brief, but it's incredibly powerful. By passing this internally as a constitutional law rather than some international treaty, Austria made a promise to the world, sure, but they kept the actual legal mechanism completely inside their own borders.
But because that law is so short, how do you actually enforce it in the real world?
Well, diplomat and international law expert Franz Seda has this brilliant comparison. He says there are basically two ways to look at Austria's stance. First, there's the corset doctrine. This is a super rigid, restrictive approach where Austria would need to strictly notify other states of any changes to its policy. Just totally bound up. And then there's what he hilariously coined the Frank Sinatra doctrine. You know the song, right? I did it my way. This means Austria retains the ultimate sovereign right to interpret its own neutrality. They decide what it means in practice, and they adapt it to fit their needs without asking for outside permission.
And because they do it their way, the policy has naturally evolved over the decades. Political scientist Martin Sen breaks this evolution down into four clear phases. First, consolidation in the late 50s and 60s, where Austria was just establishing this new identity. Second, expansion in the 70s and 80s. This is when Austria became highly engaged globally, hosting international organizations, mediating conflicts. Third, reorientation in the 90s, shifting their focus to their European neighbors after the Cold War finally ended. And fourth, stagnation in recent years, where neutrality has become kind of depoliticized. It's accepted by almost everyone, but it's rarely debated or deeply updated for the modern era.
Okay, Section 4, EU and NATO shifts.
That reorientation phase from the 90s, that is incredibly important. See, for decades, joining the European community was seen by many as totally incompatible with strict neutrality. But by 1995, the world had completely changed. Austria took two massive steps that year. They joined the European Union, and they entered NATO's Partnership for Peace program. Obviously, this kind of economic and regional integration severely challenged that strict isolationist view from the 1955 treaty. I mean, how can you be completely neutral if you're deeply tied into a European political union that essentially has its own foreign policy?
Well, they pulled it off through some very careful legal adjustments. To join the EU, Austria actually amended its constitution. They added what is now Article 23J. This little tweak legally allows Austria to participate in the EU's common foreign and security policy. It means they can, for instance, join in on European economic sanctions. On top of that, the EU treaty includes something called the Irish Clause, which explicitly states that EU defense policies absolutely must respect the specific character of neutral states like Austria and Ireland. So if an EU member is attacked, Austria decides for itself how it's going to offer support. Maybe they send humanitarian aid instead of soldiers. It lets them protect their military neutrality while still being a solid European partner. So they found a balance in the 90s. But what about today?
Let's look at Section 5, the modern neutrality test.
The global security landscape right now is placing this whole policy under immense, unprecedented pressure. The stark reality is that the current geopolitical climate is completely fracturing the map of neutrality. Following the outbreak of major war in Europe in 2022, you still have this core group of European neutrals: Austria, Ireland, Switzerland, Malta, and Moldova. But historically neutral heavyweights like Sweden and Finland, who shared a very similar post-war non-aligned stance, they looked at the new security threats and fundamentally dropped their neutrality to join NATO. Austria's neighbors entirely changed the paradigm, but Austria held the line.
However, holding the line definitely doesn't mean standing perfectly still. In July 2023, Austria took a really significant step by joining the European Sky Shield Initiative. This is a massive project to build an integrated anti-ballistic missile and air defense system alongside mostly NATO-allied countries. Naturally, some critics screamed that this straight-up violates the 1955 treaty, but the Austrian government just leaned right back into the Frank Sinatra doctrine. They justified the move by arguing that pooling resources and coordinating radar for air defense is simply a modern, legally sound adaptation. They aren't joining an alliance to go attack anyone, they are just optimizing their shield.
Now, if you are wondering why Austrian politicians keep maintaining this intense balancing act, it's simple. The public demands it. In March 2022, right as global tensions were absolutely spiking, an overwhelming 76% of Austrians favored keeping their neutrality. Only 18% wanted to join NATO. That is huge. Despite ongoing wars, despite their neighbors literally defecting to alliances, the data clearly shows that neutrality isn't just some dusty government policy, it is deeply, deeply ingrained into the cultural DNA of the Austrian people. To a nation once fractured by great powers, it represents peace, stability, and total sovereignty.
Which leaves us with his final, incredibly provocative question. Can a policy born in the fires of the Cold War truly survive the complex, highly polarized modern security landscape? Austria has proven time and again that neutrality is not passive, it's an active, evolving, and sometimes pretty contradictory balancing act. As Europe's defense architecture transforms over the coming decade, watching how Austria navigates this space is going to be one of the most fascinating stories in global politics. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer today. I really hope this gave you a crystal clear understanding of what is, for sure, a truly complex topic.
Keep learning, keep questioning, and I'll see you next time.